Hello there guys, welcome to the channel, welcome back if you've been here before. I've been so busy at work that it seems like a while since I've uploaded a video, but today I thought we would look at this SD KFZ2 Kettenkrad from Tamiya. This is a recent tooling. I thought it was only last year, but actually it was 2021 that this was released. And it replaces Tamiya's older tooling of the same vehicle. This comes in at around £20 in the UK, which for the Kettenkrad, the trailer and the three figures, I think is a pretty good price point. You might notice in this process there's quite a few eject pin marks there on the inside which I haven't filled. That's absolutely fine because they get covered up by subsequent parts. The main Kettenkraft chassis itself is a really simple construction. It does look here like there's a bit of a gap that shouldn't be there, but again that gets covered up by the later wheel pieces. Unusually for Tamiya we do get these photo etch pieces here for the engine cover, and we get a jig to bend them to the right angle as well. This cover flips up conveniently just like on the real thing, so I was able to glue everything in place but still keep the engine separate for painting. The interior, as it were, with the driver's footwell and the engine is relatively few parts. There are some manufacturers that would build these out of many separate parts, but here we've got lots of detail moulded on the small number of parts. Here is the completed engine, and as I say, that can just slot in to the bodywork once everything's been painted. The wheels were also constructed but kept separate for painting, and they feature this quite nice moulding here from Tamiya where the rear wheels are linked together, but then that excess piece of the sprue is covered up by the outer wheels. That's a nice touch and it makes the construction process much easier. And of course it helps to ensure that the wheels are all perfectly parallel to the edge of the vehicle. Here is that suspension side panel and the wheels that attach to it, and again I kept those separate for painting. Probably the fiddliest part of the kit, although by no means impossible, is the front wheel and the handlebars. These are quite delicate, and because of the way they attach to the main body, I didn't put them in place just now because the bracket that holds them in place actually stops the engine from sliding in. So I opted to paint those separately, and then once the engine was in, I glued them onto the main body. So here are all of our sub-assemblies for the Kettenkrad. I don't think I've seen any rubber band style tracks in a Tamiya kit for a while now. Here we have link and length tracks. And although we don't have the guiding notch on one of the wheels like we do on some Tamiya kits, it wasn't too hard to get those link and length pieces into position. Once they are in position, we have a separate sprue of rubber pads to go on the top, and for reasons that really escaped me, I decided to glue those on now rather than painting them separately, which of course would have been much easier. Tamiya also handily throw in a little trailer. I'm not quite sure how accurate this interior half pipe is, so I'm not sure if you could leave the cover off and have the interior of the trailer showing, but you're provided with a cover anyway and I decided to use it. As you can see from the box art and the instructions, we get 3 figures and they go together really well. I really like this new style of figure from Tamiya. All of the main parts are keyed so they go in exactly the right place, and there's no more of this sort of rotating the torso to make sure it's lined up with the legs, not quite knowing where the arms should go or anything like that. Everything goes exactly where it should do. We also get nice recesses in the uniform for the equipment to fit, so that we don't have any of these sort of ammo pouches floating a millimetre above the contours of the uniform or anything like that. So I think they look really good once they're built up. We also get a couple of choices of headgear, and for the driver 2 different head and arm positions. Moving on to the painting, I gave the entire running gear a coat of XF1 black, and the same for the engine, and some selective black pre-shading for the interior of the Kettenkrad. All the sub-assemblies were given a coat of AK Real Colours Dunkelgelb. I gave what is undoubtedly not my best ever camo scheme to the Kettenkrad, consisting of small blotches of the dark brown, red brown and the olive green. And then again, to emphasise the fact that the trailer may have come from somewhere else, I gave it a slightly different scheme with some lines, some stripes of green and red brown. Any details were then painted with Vallejo model colour. Now, you don't often catch me doing any form of chipping on my armour models, but in this case I took some Vallejo German camouflage black brown and used a sponge to give some very fine chipping. And my thought behind this was that the trailer and the Kettenkrad were really heavily used for load carrying and would probably get quite beaten up in that process. With that in mind, I concentrated the chipping on the edges that might be exposed, and on the Kettenkrad itself, on the rear, where of course feet and so on are constantly making contact with the metal. In a small number of places I also used a very fine brush to paint the same colour as a couple of scratches. I then went a bit old school, mixed up a light yellow, slightly lighter than the Dunkelgelb, and did some dry brushing across all of the surfaces to try to really bring out those raised edges. The effect is quite subtle, but it is noticeable, particularly on things like the raised detail on the wheels. Then finally for the vehicle, I took some Abteilung 502 sepia oil paint, thinned it with some odourless thinner, and applied a pin wash. And particularly in places like the wheels, that should have the effect of really bringing out the detail there. In terms of the figures, they were given a couple of coats of paints with the XF65 German Field Grey from Tamiya. The first coat was darkened with some black and shot from below. The second coat was just the pure XF65, and then the final coat was a lightened colour shot from above, with the view of getting sort of shadows and highlights there, which you can't really see on camera, but they do sort of make themselves seen in person. As always, Vallejo model colours were used for the equipment painting. And these new super fine brushes that I bought a while ago have really helped me with things like the uniform details. Finally, just like the vehicle, I went for some dry brushing. Very gently just over the most raised areas. And I quite like that shot there actually. That really does seem to show the different shadows and highlights there on that particular figure. I'm just gently building up the paint now, remembering that it might look a bit too much now, but when the paint dries and the figure is fully weathered, it will blend in a lot more. Now for the base of this, I wanted to do something slightly different. And on a recent hiking trip in Wales, I got a couple of pieces of slate like this from the ground, and I thought they would make really good bases for mini dioramas. This one here is a bit small. This one here is the perfect size. I've got the flattest side down to the desk, and then I've got a bit of natural undulation there on the stone. The second trailer you see here is one that I 3D printed a while ago. Originally I was going to include it in this diorama, but then ultimately I decided not to. Of course, while I like the slate, I don't want to use the texture of the slate for the groundwork, so I use my favourite AK Terrain's Light Earth. It's an acrylic paste, you can spread it all over. And I also use something which I bought a long time ago, which is this rocky desert sort of scatter ground cover from Diodump. I have actually used this on quite a few different dioramas, but you get so much in here that I've still got most of a tub to use up. And in fact, back when I bought this, I also bought a tub of this winter ground cover, which I've never used, and this one here, which is like a farmer's field, which again, I've never used. Anyway, I covered the surface of the slate with the terrain paste, and while that was still wet, I sprinkled a healthy dose of the ground cover all over the top. And I used the end of the paintbrush just to make some impressions of some tyre tracks and some or tank tracks in the terrain. And in hindsight, this scatter didn't take very well to that acrylic paste, probably because I put the paste down a bit thin. So later on in the build I had to go back and use some sand and gravel fixer to really make sure it was bonded. But it might have been better to do it at this stage. Now, although this ground cover is called Rocky Desert, I don't really want it to be a desert scene. Instead, I would just like to take the texture of this and make it a much sort of lighter, greyer colour, like a dusty, gravel, rocky road. Dry but not desert. Now, another product which I bought ages ago, and I've used but I've still got loads left, is the static grass tufts. For some reason I thought I'd use these everywhere, but as you can see I've only used about 3/4 of one side, and there's a whole other side still to go. These are self-adhesive, but I still use some PVA to stick them down, and to give variety I often chop them in two or tear a few bits off them so they don't all look like the same uniform tufts of grass. That said, as you'll see on the final result, I probably should have varied the height of them as well. As I mentioned, I wanted this to be more gravel than desert, so I gave the entire base a coat of a darkish grey, and then 3 or 4 different levels of slightly lighter grey each time. These were all airbrushed on, and I simply added a little bit more white each time to my grey mix. Afterwards I went back and I brush painted those grass tufts. I did try to use a variety of greens on them, but to be honest I think that's still the area of the diorama that I'm the least happy with. Nevertheless, I think for a relatively small amount of work that has produced a decent looking base. The final step then was to take the same light grey colour that I used on the base, really thin it down and give an overall dust coating to everything, the Kettenkrad, the trailer and of course the figures. And that should have the effect of blending everything together. Then my diorama was complete. So there we go guys, that was my build of the Tamiya 1/35th scale Kettenkrad and figures. This was supposed to be a relatively quick build which I started back in early December, but various things got in the way. This is my first build video in about a month, but that's because I've got several other build videos which are almost ready, they just need a bit of editing or a few final touches to the model. So hopefully I'll have a couple more to upload in the coming weeks. In the meantime, I hope you enjoyed watching this video. I really enjoyed building this kit. There's something about getting the vehicle, the trailer and 3 figures in one kit for a very reasonable price, which is just quite rewarding. I think the slate worked quite well for a diorama base and I will be using this technique in the future. In the meantime, I would like to say thank you to all of you for watching, and special thanks to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. If you would like to join either Patreon or YouTube as a member, then there are links in the description below. And until next time, thank you again for watching and have fun modelling.